Greetings once more, dear friends. Dragon here again with a brand new movie review, and today here to talk about Dogman, the latest movie from writer-director Luc Besson. And this pretty interesting, I'd call it a thriller more than an action thriller, though some of the trailers I think are pushing it slightly more on its action elements, but I would kind of say that it's very much a thriller. We'll get into the film in a little second, but I think it's maybe worth explaining a little bit about my kind of relationship with Luc Besson's movies over the years, because it's always been a little bit of a weird back and forth where I don't unabashedly love his stuff. There's always kind of some things in there that don't sit quite right with me. I really enjoyed La Femme Nikita, which is like his first movie that I'd ever seen. Then went back and saw The Big Blue. Absolutely adored Leon. And I still think Leon is probably his masterpiece as a filmmaker. I don't think he's ever really managed to kind of quite top that movie. I really enjoy The Fifth Element, though there are some things in that movie that don't quite sit that well with me. Notably, Chris Tucker's performance in that is really like nails on a blackboard. But even when he's not kind of hitting a home run, there's always a lot in his movies that I do really enjoy, and I think stylistically he's always really interesting. I think maybe, possibly, the stuff of his that I enjoy the most is when he's worked as a writer. So kind of probably most notably on the Taxi movies, the first two Taxi films, absolutely incredible. 3, 4 and 5, not quite so much, but they're movies that he just wrote, he didn't direct. And then Danny the Dog, I have to mention, released as Unleashed in the rest of the world, but originally was titled Danny the Dog, starring Jet Li and set in and around Glasgow, which always makes me very, very happy. But yeah, Danny the Dog I still think kind of one of Jet Li's best non-Hong Kong or non-Chinese based productions. So when I heard that Dogman was coming, I couldn't not think about Danny the Dog, particularly where there's a little bit of an overlap. But getting into Dogman itself, finally, now that we're 2 minutes into this review, Caleb Landry Jones is playing Douglas Monroe, a guy really with a very, very rough lot in life. His dad seems to raise dogs for, I think, dog fighting, though the film doesn't dwell on that too much, but he's very sympathetic to the dogs. Everybody in his close family, with the exception of his mum, really treats him like dirt. So he's got a really religious brother who is kind of constantly snitching on him anytime that he's trying to interact with the dogs or sneak them food, because the dad is starving the dogs, presumably to make them more vicious fighters. And ultimately, after being caught feeding the dogs on one or too many occasions, his dad decides to basically sever him from the family and throw him in with the dogs. So he basically spends most of his childhood locked up in a cage with this pack of dogs. When the film starts, he's being arrested as a grown adult, dressed up like Marilyn Monroe from Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Hard to say, is that all kind of pink dress that Marilyn Monroe was always famous for wearing in one of her sequences. So he's dressed up like Marilyn Monroe in a wheelchair, driving a truck, whole truck's filled with dogs. And he's then arrested and then is met with a psychiatrist played by Jojo T. Gibbs. She's playing a psychiatrist called Evelyn. And really, through their conversations, we start seeing flashbacks back to his really rough childhood when he was basically in a cage with all the dogs, kind of through to what happened when he eventually escaped that situation. Minor spoiler, becoming handicapped in the process or ending up in a wheelchair in the process. And then his sort of struggle to kind of try and fit into society, ends up running a dog shelter. So he has this large pack of dogs with him, which I think is kind of something that he's become attached to from when he was still really, really young, but realizes that he has an almost kind of psychic connection to the dogs, where anything that he asks them to do, they're able to do. At this point, I kind of got slight shades of a really great, kind of quite underloved or underappreciated movie called The Doberman Gang, which maybe explored some of the themes that we see in Dogman, maybe slightly better. And little shades of Willard as well, with Crispin Glover, when he was a guy who had an incredible connection with rats. So those two movies were kind of quite at the front of my mind when I was kind of going into Dogman, because as we see more of the flashbacks to kind of how Douglas's life's unfolded, we realise he's been using the dogs to kind of right some wrongs in the neighbourhood where he's been living. He sends the dogs out against these sort of local gangsters who are running a protection racket, and then ultimately starts using them in a series of home invasions. So he's using the dogs to sneak in and steal jewellery and kind of money, other things that are lying around the homes of incredibly rich people, which he sees as sort of redistributing the wealth. So he kind of a little bit of a Robin Hood mentality. And in the middle of this, he also ends up with a part-time job working at a drag club. So he does performances on stage where he's kind of basically singing largely Edith Piaf songs. And that's kind of really where the film seemed to kind of find its groove. And so certainly I think where Caleb Landry Jones seemed to kind of find the most fun in the film during those sections, because the character's constantly dressing up as different people. So it's been compared to the Joker in a few reviews that I've seen. I think that's largely because he's applying like white face paint. It's not really that close to the more recent Todd Phillips Joker movie. I didn't really see that many comparisons, though the Dogman, as the character he is in this, would make a pretty great Batman villain in this sort of new Robert Pattinson era Batman, but very separate worlds. And taking the movie just for what it is, as its own thing, I think as a thriller it's really interesting. As a character study, it's really, really well done. And both performances by our two main leads, so by Caleb Landry Jones and by Jojo T. Gibbs playing the psychiatrist, are really good, and the two of them play really well off each other. Jojo T. Gibbs doesn't have a huge amount to do as Evelyn, but she's able to kind of make you buy her character pretty quickly. But really, largely, it's a kind of one-man show. It's Caleb Landry Jones acting with a huge amount of really pretty cute dogs, and the dogs often doing pretty fun things. So most of the kind of real high points of the movie kind of came in his interaction with the dogs, and particularly when he's sending them off to do missions. I wish there was a whole bunch more of that, and I kind of feel, looking back to Willard, there maybe would have been some scope to kind of see him working with slightly kind of training the dogs to do some of the things that he does. It would have been nice to kind of see him kind of diving deeper into that sort of relationship. As it sort of is, there's an awful lot of him applying makeup and listening to old records, which is cool. But for a movie that's almost 2 hours long, I kind of thought maybe he could have used his runtime a little bit differently. And I would have maybe enjoyed the movie just a touch more than I did. But cinematography incredible by Colin Wandersman, I believe. And it's a reunion of Luc Besson with his composer, Eric Serra, who he worked with back on all the way back to Leon. So he's kind of coming in to work on the score. There are quite a lot of needle drops. A lot of them are old kind of French records, which is kind of cool to hear, and particularly the Edith Piaf ones. The Edith Piaf songs that he performs on stage really, really good. And then we get one of her more famous songs towards the end with the one big kind of action sequence that you'll see in the trailers, which is kind of, I think, maybe making people think that this is more of an action movie than it is, because it does have a pretty kind of bombastic climax where the people that he'd tried to basically stop running their protection racket come back in force to try and take him down, and his abandoned school that he's living in now is seemingly filled with a whole bunch of different traps, which the dogs are very adept at leading people into or pushing people into. And that whole little kind of last reel was pretty good fun to see. But all in all, about as much of a strange relationship as I've had with previous Luc Besson movies. I think definitely one to rent if you're curious about it. We're not going to get the chance to see it on the big screen, which is a shame, because I think it would have lended itself well to a cinema release, but that's not to be the case for us here in the UK. For my friends watching in the States, if you're seeing this playing at your local theatre, then definitely do go around and check it out. But I'd say definitely worth giving this a digital release rental and give it a chance to check out the film if you're in any way a fan of Luc Besson's previous things. And if you haven't seen Danny the Dog at this point, I would say go back and track down Danny the Dog. So although Luc Besson didn't direct it, he only wrote it. It was directed by Louis Leterrier. It explores some of the same themes of a young boy who's raised really with dogs, but in a very different, much more martial arts and very young Scott Adkins starring way. Because there was a small brief appearance by Scott Adkins in Danny the Dog, and a really great soundtrack from Massive Attack, amongst others, in Danny the Dog, aka Unleashed. But for Dogman, I think one out of two thumbs up for this one. Kind of one that I, as is always the case with Luc Besson stuff, really want to enjoy more than I kind of ultimately end up doing. But there's an awful lot here that I think people will find of interest. I would encourage you to definitely see it if you're curious and if you're a fan of his previous stuff. I've been the Fanatical Dragon. Thank you so much for watching this. I'll see you on the next one. Have a great weekend.